What I'm going to do in my remarks is to set out in a very, very big picture where I think we came from and where we are. I'm going to discuss also a little bit about where we might be going, but as I like to say, forecasting the future is above my pay grade. If I could do that, I wouldn't write columns for a newspaper. Of course, I think that nobody can forecast the future, but that doesn't stop people from trying. What I'm going to do anyway is to set out an analysis of, I think, where we are and where we're going. The title of this speech is The Shift and the Shocks. It'll become pretty obvious what I'm talking about. It may be already quite obvious. I should say that this is the title of a book I've just contracted to write over the rest of this year. And I stole the title from two very good friends of mine with their permission. They used it in a very nice little article, buried in the middle. Like most academics, they had no idea when they'd actually got a good phrase. So as I said to them, I'm going to liberate it. So, the shift and the shocks, and how do they relate to where we are and going? The shift is, I think, pretty obvious. We are living through an astonishingly swift, unprecedentedly swift shift in the relative economic size of nations. And since in the modern world, economic power is the basis of power, it's also inevitably a shift in global power. I'd like to just start by laying out a couple of facts which sort of set out very simple way, very starkly, what's been going on. They won't surprise you perhaps, but I think if I bring them together, they will have a certain force. The first comes from the International Monetary Fund's World Economic Outlook database, universally used. And if you look at this database and you ask yourself, how fast have the current developed countries been growing relative to the current emerging and developing countries, you will find that up to the end of the 1990s, that is to say up to the end of the last century, the growth of these economies was roughly similar. In the 1990s, a small gap emerged, but it was not very significant, and the relative size of the developed and the developing countries in aggregate was roughly unchanged. In the last 10 years, the growth of the developed countries in aggregate has been about 1.75%, which is lower than at any time since the war. Over the same 10 years, the growth of the emerging countries has been slightly over 6%. And on the IMF's forecasts, this difference will widen further to something like 3.5 to 1. Just to put this in context, if that were to continue, the developing and emerging countries in aggregate, their economies will double in size, and that is the economy of 85% of humanity, roughly speaking, every 12 years. Well, we basically are growing hardly at all. And that leads me to my second figure, which is about what's happened during the crisis. Again, this may be completely obvious to you, but it is still very striking. If you take 2007 as the starting point, and you take the IMF's forecast for 2012 as the end, so this is just 5 years, over that period, the economies of the entire developed world, that is the US, North America, that is essentially US, Canada, Europe, Japan, that's basically what it is, will have grown essentially zero. 5 years, zero. Over the same period, the economies of emerging Asia, which is East and South Asia and contains just about half of the world's population, will have expanded by just over 50%. This is an extraordinary and unprecedented shift that is occurring in the relative size of economies. In its nature, The only comparable event in the last 150 years was the rise of the US in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But that occurred at a vastly slower rate, at a vastly slower relative rate. China is basically doing in 10 to 20 years what the US did in 40 or 50.